Hey Shad and the guys, I saw that you just had a video talking about Chinese swords and you were having a little difficulty with them, so I thought I'd make a quick response video. Just a quick note, usually I'd have a lot of swords to share with you to be able to do show and tell. I'm on vacation right now, so I don't have access to that. Another quick note, while I do handle a lot of swords and I study Chinese sword history, I'm not the #1 expert on Chinese swords. I will always direct folks to my good friend, the Scholar General, Keith, and also the Great River Taoist Center and Scott Riddell. I'll link to both of them below for anyone who'd like to dive deeper into Chinese swordsmanship. Now, you have a couple of things that are going on here that might be confounding you, so I'll break it down into a couple of parts. We'll talk about the examples that you have there in the cross-section that you're having difficulty with, and then we'll talk about where you can find accurate Chinese swords and also kind of the history of Chinese sword manufacturing. So let's do the last one first. So something a little bit unusual about Chinese sword manufacturing compared to other places is how the swords are put together. So if you order a sword from the United States, from England, from a location in Germany or Hungary, etc., you're usually working with a single shop or a single forge, or in many cases a single individual smith who's responsible for the entire construction of the blade, the hilt, the furniture, the scabbard if it comes with it, and then it's shipped out to you. That is not the case in China, especially in Longchuan in southern China. They have an entire industry, an entire city dedicated to the production of swords, and as such they're constructed in the kind of ancient way where you have multiple artisans, multiple craftsmen that are dedicated just to producing single elements of swords. You have craftsmen that are dedicated just to producing fullers of swords. You have others that are just dedicated to the polish of swords and individual swords types, perhaps just working on, Korean swords or just working on Japanese swords. You have others that are dedicated just to making the fittings, so maybe the cross guards of swords, etc. This is how swords were made historically in all corners of the world. You'd have one person that was just a cutler. They would ship the blades anywhere in the world, whoever was buying them in bulk. And then you'd have faubourgers who would put them together, who would fit them in the local style. You'd have them shipped over to the scabbard makers, and then someone would finally buy them at a shop to taste. As a result, you will see a lot more of that in China. It's not impossible to buy them from a single outfit that is making everything from start to finish. You will see a lot more sharing and sharing alike. This is especially notable on the Japanese side of things, where if you're trying to get fittings, for example, Fujikashira, Suba, etc., you'll see the same type of parts being used over and over and over again through various vendors, because the same pool of casting equipment, the same pool of Suba, for example, are shared among multiple people who are trying to purchase from them. So if you notice that a blade is similar from one vendor to another, that may be the reason for it in part. Now again, there are individuals who are able to custom source and secure exclusivity with individual artisans so that their lines look distinct and different than everyone else. So this is not true across the board, but depending on what shop you're talking about, you'll see a lot of muddying of the waters and a lot of familiarity with designs across the various swords. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to accuracy in Chinese swords in particular, there's a bit of a cultural thing that's going on. Historically, in China, you cannot own a sharp sword. It is illegal to own a sharp sword. So the type of swords being produced for domestic consumption have not been functional sharp swords. There is a lot of production of swords for export, and the most popular sword for export are Japanese swords. So believe it or not, the ability for them to produce accurate, sharp, very well-functioning Japanese swords in China is tremendous. There is a huge industry for Nihonto, or Chinese-made Japanese swords, and they're very, very good at it. But up until recently, the market for Chinese-style swords, so Jian and Dao, has pretty much only been domestic. It's only been for those people who are in China. And the ones who are interested in buying Chinese swords have been folks who want a sword that looks really good, so it's very, very gaudy, a high-end sword, an imperial sword, a sword for a general. It has lots of bling on it, but does not cut, because they haven't been allowed to use swords that are made for cutting inside of China. That's been the rules. Only very recently has there been any interest in making high fidelity, accurate reproductions of functional, original Chinese designs. This has mostly been spearheaded by LK Chen, although there have been a couple others. Again, Scott Riddell has developed his own line of functional Chinese swords. So we're really only talking about the last 5 or 10 years that anyone has been trying to develop functional Chinese swords compared to decades of developing things like Japanese swords. The European market is even slower. So even though China, southern China, has been making swords and swords and swords and swords for as far back as you can remember, they're kind of nascent in their ability to produce functional, authentic, and very well-made Chinese swords, especially across the many, many different dynastic periods. LK Chen is leading the way in this, although the type of swords he makes are very different than, for instance, the ones you're showing. The ones you're showing are very, again, flashy, very gaudy examples from various dynastic periods. They're actually kind of a bit of a mishmash of different dynastic periods. He tends to go for the more kind of Spartan, kind of just baseline military models that would be carried by infantry troopers that are very, very functional, very, very killy, but don't necessarily look really high-end. He can make high-end examples, but that's not the focus of what he's interested in. So to that end, if you're looking for a sword, a Chinese sword, that is going to represent how the original antique examples functioned, you really only have a couple of good examples out there. LK Chen is by far the #1 maker who is leading the way, doing original research on antiques and bringing them to bear at a good price. The Art of Fire and Iron is another one. They do kind of semi-custom work, but their swords, if you can get them, are a reasonable price, and the research they do is good on them. Some examples from Cold Steel can be okay. They're not the best, but some of them actually handle like original, so they're good. Again, Scott Riddell has a couple cutting Jian and Dao through a seven-star trading company, so that's another example that you could look into if you're interested in using actual cutting swords. So that's a quick background on why if you just randomly will go and select from a vendor a Jian or a Dao, there's a high likelihood that it will not perform like the original antiques did, because there aren't very many. First of all, we have very few antiques to study and compared to many other places of the world, just because of the history that China has with swords. But two, most vendors have not taken the time to research the antiques and be able to bring them to bear. Now, that doesn't mean there are that many manufacturers that are not good. There are plenty of good Chinese manufacturers who are making very good swords. You've got Swordier, you've got Hanban, you've got all these great manufacturers out of China that could be making very, very good swords, just not always necessarily Chinese swords in particular. The swords that you have in particular, for instance, the Jian that you were looking at, they are based on very, very old designs. Those type of cross-sections are 8-sided cross-sections, and that's actually a Bronze Age design. It was made that way to reinforce the edges because the bronze that was in use was softer than the steel that came later, and so they needed to reinforce the edge, so it doesn't have a very keen edge. It has a very strong, robust edge, more like an axe, because that was necessary when you were working with bronze. It was actually a very innovative technique to have such a thick cross-section and be able to make such a long blade during the Bronze period. And that did carry over into the Steel Age. You had very early development of steel in places like the Kingdom of Chu. The Kingdom of Yue, I think, may also have developed that prior to the unification of China under the Qing, under the Qi dynasty. And so that's a very popular like early Han period design that has been imitated tremendously. But that is something that we really don't see after, you know, the 1st and 2nd century BC. So you're talking about an incredibly old design of blade. It was used. It is commonly imitated because it looks really cool, but it's not often executed well, and it is not something that you would see on later dynastic period swords, which appears to be at least one of your hilts looks perhaps like a Ming period hilt. So if you're having trouble cutting with it, I wouldn't be surprised for a couple of reasons. So I hope that helps explain it. If you want a good example of that sword, I would look into the LK Chen Magnificent Chu Jian. That is an example of how that very complex blade geometry could be done well. I hope this video helps you guys out. Please enjoy and keep on looking at Chinese swords, because there's an amazing amount of history there. Take care, guys.